The Airbus A350's cabin lights dimmed over the Atlantic. Flight attendant Jessica Martinez noticed passenger 12C hadn't moved in hours. "Ma'am, we need you awake for landing preparations." Trinity Sinclair's eyes snapped open. At 34, the woman in faded jeans looked unremarkable. Weathered dog tags clinked softly beneath her civilian sweater. "System failure!" Captain Fletcher's voice cracked over the intercom. "Navigation down completely. Any military pilots aboard?" Passengers erupted in whispers. The businessman beside Trinity scoffed. "Military pilots on a commercial flight?" Trinity stood slowly, her movement precise despite appearing ordinary. Hidden hearing aids caught fragments of panicked radio chatter bleeding through the speakers. Fletcher's voice returned, desperate now. "Repeat. Any combat pilots? Identify yourselves immediately." Trinity walked toward the cockpit, dog tags swaying with each step. 3 years of medical retirement had convinced everyone she was finished. In 15 minutes, they'd discover why the Air Force called her Ghost. If you believe some heroes don't announce themselves, type Ghost in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Delta Flight 892 had been airborne for 6 hours when the first navigation system failed. Trinity Ghost, Sinclair, felt the subtle change in engine harmonics before the crew announced anything. An instinct honed through 89 combat missions over Syrian airspace where mechanical failure meant death. She'd chosen seat 12C deliberately, middle of the aircraft, for optimal balance during turbulence. The faded military field jacket folded in her lap told a story most passengers would never recognize. 3 bronze stars, a distinguished flying cross, and a Purple Heart earned over 4 deployments flying F-16 Fighting Falcons in support of Operation Inherent Resolve. But that was before the explosion that shattered her inner ear, leaving her with 60% hearing loss and vertigo episodes that ended her flying career. The Air Force Medical Board's verdict had been swift and final. Major Sinclair's condition makes her unsuitable for flight operations. Captain Zachariah Fletcher's voice cut through her memories. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation equipment. Please remain seated while we work through our procedures." Technical difficulties. Trinity almost smiled at the euphemism. She'd heard that phrase countless times in briefings where technical difficulties meant surface-to-air missiles were painting your aircraft with targeting radar. Around her, passengers shifted restlessly. The businessman in 12B, corporate type, expensive watch, condescending smile, had spent the first hour of the flight loudly discussing his latest acquisition deal. Now he looked worried, fingers drumming against his armrest. Behind them, a family with 2 young children tried to maintain normalcy. The father whispered reassurances while the mother held their sleeping toddler closer. Trinity recognized the look in their eyes, the particular anxiety that came from being helpless while others controlled your fate. The aircraft shuddered as it entered rougher air. Outside, storm clouds stretched to the horizon like an approaching army. Trinity's trained eye cataloged the signs: towering cumulonimbus formations, lightning flickering in the distance, the subtle green tinge that indicated severe weather ahead. She'd flown through storms like this over the Mediterranean, threading F-16s between thunderheads that reached 50,000 feet into the stratosphere. The key wasn't avoiding weather. Sometimes you couldn't. The key was understanding its patterns, reading its moods, finding the gaps that existed even in the most violent systems. First Officer Rebecca Chen's voice joined Fletcher's over the intercom, both trying to project confidence they clearly didn't feel. "We're in contact with air traffic control and working on alternative routing around the weather system." Trinity closed her eyes and listened to the aircraft's voice, the subtle vibrations that told stories about airspeed, altitude, and stress loading. Every aircraft had its own language, and she'd learned to speak fluent F-16 during countless hours of combat operations. The hearing aids in her ears picked up fragments of radio chatter bleeding through the cabin speakers. Words like navigation failure, storm system intensifying, and unable to establish position, painted a picture the crew wasn't sharing with passengers. Trinity's hand moved unconsciously to the dog tags beneath her sweater, worn metal bearing her name, blood type, and serial number. They'd saved her life once, helping medics identify her unconscious body after her final mission went catastrophically wrong. The aircraft bucked violently as they entered the storm's outer bands. Overhead bins rattled, and several passengers grabbed their armrests with white knuckles. Captain Fletcher's voice returned, strain evident despite his professional training. "Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Fletcher speaking. We've lost primary navigation systems due to what appears to be widespread equipment interference. I'm asking if there are any military pilots aboard who might assist with emergency procedures." The businessman beside Trinity snorted. "Military pilots? What's next? Asking for rocket scientists?" His voice carried the particular arrogance of someone who'd never faced a crisis he couldn't buy his way out of. Trinity remained still, watching other passengers crane their necks, looking for someone who fit their image of a military pilot. Tall, broad-shouldered, probably male, certainly not a slight woman in civilian clothes whose only distinguishing feature was the careful way she moved, as if every gesture were calculated for maximum efficiency. "Any pilots with combat experience, please identify yourselves immediately," Fletcher continued, and now Trinity heard something new in his voice, genuine fear. She'd heard that tone before, in radio transmissions from pilots whose aircraft were disintegrating around them. It was the sound of someone discovering that their training, their procedures, their faith in technology weren't enough to save them. The storm hit them like a physical assault. Lightning illuminated the cabin in stroboscopic flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the aircraft's very bones. The ride became a violent roller coaster of updrafts and downdrafts that sent unsecured items flying through the cabin. What Captain Fletcher didn't know, what none of the 247 souls aboard Flight 892 knew, was that they were flying into a meteorological phenomenon that occurred perhaps once every 20 years. A storm system so massive and violent that it was creating its own electromagnetic interference, disrupting navigation satellites and ground-based radio beacons across a 1,000-mile radius. Trinity recognized the signs because she'd encountered similar conditions over Syria, where enemy jamming combined with natural atmospheric interference had forced her to navigate using techniques that predated GPS by 50 years. Dead reckoning, celestial navigation when possible, and what her flight instructor had called educated guessing with extreme prejudice. The aircraft dropped suddenly, passengers screaming as they experienced momentary weightlessness. Trinity's hearing aids screeched with electronic interference, but beneath the chaos, she could hear something others couldn't, the subtle change in engine note that indicated the pilots were fighting to maintain control. "Sir," she said quietly to the businessman, "I need to get to the cockpit." He looked at her like she'd suggested jumping out of the aircraft. "Lady, they're looking for military pilots, not passengers having panic attacks." Trinity stood, her movement fluid despite the violent turbulence. Years of flying combat missions had taught her to function normally while being thrown around a cockpit like a rag doll. She made her way forward, using the careful balance that came from countless hours of formation, flying where a single mistake could kill your wingman. Flight attendant Jessica Martinez intercepted her near the galley, professional smile strained by the circumstances. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We're experiencing severe turbulence." "I'm Major Trinity Sinclair, United States Air Force," Trinity said, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. "Captain Fletcher asked for military pilots." Jessica's skepticism was obvious. Trinity looked nothing like the Hollywood image of a fighter pilot. At 5'4", with prematurely silver-streaked brown hair and features that most people would describe as average, she could blend into any crowd, which had been exactly the point during her years flying close air support missions where anonymity meant survival. "Ma'am, I really need you to—" Trinity pulled out her military ID, the worn plastic card that had gotten her through checkpoints from Jordan to Turkey. "F-16 Fighting Falcon, 4 combat deployments, 89 missions over Syria." "What's your navigation status?" Jessica's expression shifted as she registered the ID's authenticity. The plastic was worn smooth from years of use, and the photograph showed a younger Trinity in dress blues, ribbons visible on her chest that spoke of combat service and personal valor. "Follow me," Jessica said, leading her toward the cockpit. As they moved forward, Trinity caught fragments of radio chatter that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Multiple aircraft in the region were reporting navigation failures. Air traffic control centers were losing radar contact with flights across the eastern Atlantic. This wasn't just an equipment malfunction, it was a system-wide emergency. What Captain Fletcher didn't realize was that Trinity had encountered this exact scenario before. Not the storm, but the cascade of technological failures that occurred when multiple systems failed simultaneously. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether an emergency was recoverable or whether you were about to become a very expensive crater. The way she moved through the turbulent cabin, maintaining balance without conscious thought, followed patterns learned during 89 combat missions where losing spatial orientation meant death. Her hearing aids were picking up radio frequencies that the aircraft's speakers couldn't reproduce, giving her information about the crisis that even the flight crew didn't possess. The cockpit was a chaos of blinking warning lights and urgent alarms. Captain Fletcher looked up as Trinity entered, his face pale beneath his captain's hat. First Officer Chen was bent over emergency checklists, sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. "Thank God," Fletcher breathed. "We need all the help we can get." Trinity's trained eye swept the instrument panel, cataloging failures with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to diagnose catastrophic problems under enemy fire. The situation was worse than she'd expected, not just navigation failure, but cascading systems errors that suggested electromagnetic interference on a massive scale. "How long since the GPS went down?" she asked, settling into the jump seat behind them. 37 minutes, Chen replied without looking up from her manual. "Started with satellite navigation, then spread to inertial guidance, backup compass systems. Even our storm radar is giving intermittent readings." Trinity nodded, pieces of a familiar puzzle falling into place. She'd seen this before over Syria, when enemy electronic warfare systems had created similar conditions. The key was understanding that when all your technology failed simultaneously, you reverted to basics, principles of flight that hadn't changed since the Wright brothers. "What's your fuel status?" 14,000 pounds, Fletcher answered. "At current consumption, maybe 75 minutes of flight time." 75 minutes to find a suitable airport, navigate to it without instruments, and land in weather that was deteriorating by the minute. Trinity had faced worse odds, but never with 247 civilians depending on her decisions. "Captain, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "Your training taught you to trust instruments, follow procedures, and rely on air traffic control for guidance. Combat flying taught me that all of those things can fail at the worst possible moment." She gestured toward the storm visible through the cockpit windows, where lightning created a continuous light show that turned day into flickering night. "What we're going to do is navigate using techniques that predate GPS by about 70 years. Dead reckoning, radio triangulation if we can find functioning beacons, and something my instructor called tactical intuition." Chen almost smiled despite the circumstances. Almost. The radio crackled with transmissions from other aircraft, voices tight with controlled panic as pilots across the region reported similar equipment failures. Air traffic control centers were struggling to track aircraft that had vanished from their screens but continued to fly, invisible ghosts in a system that depended entirely on electronic surveillance. Trinity's hand found the dog tags beneath her sweater, and something fundamental shifted in her approach to the crisis. The worn metal wasn't just identification. It connected her to every pilot who'd faced impossible odds and refused to accept defeat. For the first time in 3 years, the doubt that had plagued her since her medical retirement began to fade, replaced by the cold certainty that had carried her through 89 combat missions. The dog tags Trinity wore told a story the Air Force had classified for national security reasons. Operation Syria Phoenix, a mission so dangerous that only volunteers were accepted, so secret that it didn't officially exist in any military record. Trinity had been flying escort for a rescue helicopter attempting to extract a downed reconnaissance pilot deep in enemy territory. The mission required threading F-16s through a canyon system at night, in weather, with surface-to-air missiles tracking every movement. Her wingman, Captain Marcus Reaper Johnson, had taken the lead position because Trinity was the newer pilot, despite her proven skills. They'd known each other for 2 years, flown 43 missions together, saved each other's lives more times than they could count. The missile that found Reaper's aircraft came without warning, a Russian-made system that the intelligence briefings hadn't mentioned. Trinity watched her best friend's F-16 disintegrate in a ball of orange flame, debris scattered across a mountainside that maps showed as uninhabited, but which she knew contained villages full of innocent people. The rescue helicopter was 10 minutes out when Trinity made a decision that would end her flying career. She stayed to provide close air support, using her aircraft's cannon to suppress enemy positions until the helicopter could extract both the original downed pilot and Reaper, who had somehow survived his ejection with multiple fractures and internal bleeding. The explosion that damaged Trinity's inner ear came from her own aircraft. A fragment of enemy shrapnel had severed hydraulic lines, causing a cascade failure that forced her to eject at an altitude that should have killed her. She'd survived by pure luck, and because Reaper, despite his injuries, had talked her through the ejection sequence over their emergency radio frequency. The dog tags she wore weren't just hers. Embedded in the chain was one of Reaper's, recovered from his destroyed aircraft and given to her during his medal ceremony 6 months later. He'd survived, returned to flight status, and continued serving. She'd been medically retired, deemed too damaged to trust with a $30 million fighter aircraft. Every morning for 3 years, Trinity had put on those dog tags as a reminder of what she'd lost. Not just her career, but her identity as someone who could be trusted with other people's lives. The Air Force Medical Board had been clear. Vertigo and hearing loss made her unsuitable for any flight operations. Now, suspended between heaven and hell at 35,000 feet, those same dog tags served a different purpose. They reminded her that survival wasn't about perfect hearing or spatial orientation that never wavered. It was about making decisions under pressure, accepting responsibility for outcomes, and refusing to quit when other people's lives hung in the balance. What Trinity didn't tell Fletcher and Chen was that MacDill Air Force Base, their intended destination, was where she'd first deployed from 9 years earlier. Colonel Isaiah Warren, now the base commander, had been her squadron leader during her early career. When Warren learned that the medically retired pilot he'd once recommended for promotion had talked a commercial crew through one of the most challenging flights in recent memory, he would understand that the military's approach to evaluating damaged veterans might need fundamental revision. "Here's what we're going to do," Trinity continued, her voice cutting through the cockpit noise with the clarity of someone who'd briefed dozens of life-or-death missions. "We're going to navigate using compass heading, timing, and speed calculations. Old school, but reliable when everything else fails." She pointed to the magnetic compass, one of the few instruments still functioning normally. "Based on our last known position and elapsed time, we should be approximately here." Her finger traced a point on the chart that showed empty ocean punctuated by isolated islands. "Captain, reduce power to economy cruise settings. We need to stretch our fuel as far as possible while maintaining enough airspeed to handle this turbulence." Fletcher complied, and immediately the ride smoothed slightly as their reduced speed made them less susceptible to the storm's violent air currents. Trinity had learned this technique over Syria, where fuel conservation often meant the difference between completing a mission and becoming a prisoner of war. The radio suddenly crackled with a transmission that made all 3 of them freeze. Any aircraft, this is Coast Guard Cutter Resolute. We are observing multiple aircraft in distress and are prepared to provide navigation assistance." Trinity grabbed the microphone. Coast Guard Resolute, this is Major Sinclair aboard Delta Flight 892. We have navigation system failure and are attempting emergency routing. Can you provide position reference? The response came immediately. Flight 892, Resolute. We have you on radar bearing approximately 090 degrees from our position, distance unknown due to weather interference. Our coordinates are 38 degrees 15 minutes north, 65 degrees 45 minutes west. For the first time in 40 minutes, Trinity had a fixed reference point. The Coast Guard vessel's position put them roughly 200 miles southeast of their intended flight path. Not catastrophic, but concerning given their limited fuel. She began calculating vectors in her head, the kind of three-dimensional navigation mathematics that had been drilled into her through countless training exercises. The solution required them to fly a modified Great Circle route that would take them through the heart of the storm system, but would also put them on a direct path to MacDill Air Force Base. "Gentlemen," she said, studying the weather radar display, where swirling colors painted a picture of atmospheric violence that stretched across their entire flight path. "We're going to thread the needle." The approach to MacDill Air Force Base began 40 miles out, with Trinity guiding Fletcher and Chen through an instrument approach that tested every skill she'd learned in 9 years of military flying. The weather had deteriorated to minimums that pushed the boundaries of what civilian aircraft were certified to attempt. "Delta 892, MacDill approach control," the radio crackled. "We have you on radar. Current weather is 200-foot ceiling, half-mile visibility in heavy rain. Be advised, we have emergency equipment standing by." Trinity felt a chill that had nothing to do with the aircraft's air conditioning. Emergency equipment meant they were expecting the worst, an outcome that would validate every doubt about her fitness for flight operations that had haunted her since her medical retirement. But as they descended through the storm clouds, something remarkable happened. The skills that had made her one of the Air Force's most reliable combat pilots began to assert themselves. Her hearing loss, which had seemed so debilitating in peaceful circumstances, became irrelevant when she could feel the aircraft's responses through the seat of her pants and the vibrations in the control surfaces. The vertigo that had ended her career proved manageable when she had specific tasks to focus on, radio calls to make, calculations to perform, decisions that required her full attention. Combat flying had taught her to function despite physical limitations, to compensate for equipment failures through experience and determination. "Flight 892, you are 5 miles from touchdown. Runway in sight?" Fletcher peered through the rain-streaked windscreen, trying to spot the runway lights through the murk. "Negative, no runway contact." Trinity had been in this situation before, approaching Syrian airstrips at night with sandstorms reducing visibility to 0. The key was trusting instruments over visual cues, maintaining precise control inputs, and refusing to let doubt creep into your decision-making process. "Captain, maintain current glide slope. The runway will appear exactly where the instruments say it should be." And it did. The lights materialized out of the gray at the last possible moment, a welcome stripe of illumination that marked safety and survival. Fletcher's landing was textbook perfect, firm but controlled, with reverse thrust and braking that brought them to a stop with fuel to spare. As the engines spun down and passengers burst into applause, Trinity realized that something fundamental had changed. For 3 years, she'd believed the medical board's assessment that her injuries made her unsuitable for flight operations. Today had proven that sometimes the most valuable pilots were those who had been broken by combat and rebuilt themselves through sheer determination. The call sign Ghost had taken on new meaning. She wasn't a ghost because her career was over. She was a ghost because everyone assumed she was finished, only to discover she was still very much present when circumstances demanded her particular combination of skills and experience. Through the cockpit window, she could see a familiar figure standing near the base operations building. Colonel Isaiah Warren's posture was unmistakable even at a distance. The same officer who had recommended her for promotion 9 years earlier, before combat damaged her body and bureaucracy damaged her spirit. Colonel Warren was waiting as Trinity stepped off the aircraft. his expression mixing pride with something that looked like regret. Behind him stood a delegation of Air Force officers who had come to witness the arrival of the Ghost flight, an aircraft that had vanished from radar but continued to fly, guided by a pilot whose medical file suggested she was unfit for flight operations. "Major Sinclair," Warren said, using her rank despite her retirement status. "Outstanding work." The words carried weight beyond simple congratulation. They represented acknowledgement that the military's approach to evaluating damaged veterans might need fundamental revision. Experience and judgment, Trinity had proven, could compensate for physical limitations in ways that medical evaluations never considered. 3 months later, Major Trinity Ghost Sinclair reported for duty at MacDill's new Crisis Management and Emergency Response Training Center. Her first assignment, developing curriculum for pilots who needed to function when technology failed and experience became the only reliable navigation system. True strength isn't measured by perfect health or flawless equipment. It's measured by the ability to find solutions when everyone else sees only problems, to accept help when needed, and to serve others despite personal limitations. Sometimes the most valuable heroes are those who refuse to stay grounded, even when the whole world tells them their flying days are over. Thank you to everyone who typed Ghost. Your support recognizes that real heroes often serve quietly, without recognition, carrying the weight of service long after their official duties end. If you believe more people need to hear stories like Trinity's, please share this video and subscribe for more tales of dignity.